At night, when the house had gone quiet, I stood by the dresser in our bedroom, unsure why I felt compelled to open its drawer. It wasn't one of those moments when you're looking for something specific. It was more like you were trying to pass the time, avoiding the emptiness inside. In the drawer, I came across an old box of photographs left behind by my mother. The box smelled of dust and paper, a scent that hit my nose like the opening of a door into the past. One photograph stood out from the rest. It showed my mother, Selena, and Milo, her second husband, my stepfather. They were standing in the garden of our old house, surrounded by the lush greenery of spring. But something about their pose and their expressions made me linger on this photograph longer than usual. Their hands seemed too close, their gazes too deep. For the first time, it crossed my mind that their relationship might not have been as simple as I'd always assumed. The phone vibrated on the nightstand. A voice message from Clayton. His voice sounded casual as always, though his words carried an attempt to show care. "Sorry, honey, working late again. This project just won't let me go. I'll be home late, but I'll call when I'm on my way." I mumbled something in response, even though I knew he wouldn't hear it. The sound of his voice, which used to comfort me, now left me indifferent. Not because I didn't love him. No, I knew I loved him. It was just that something between us had changed. Or perhaps it was me who had changed. The next morning, I was gathering my thoughts when Milo knocked on the door. His appearance was unexpected, but he explained it simply. "Thought I'd help you out with the house. Looks like you still haven't cleared out the garage." I agreed, even though I could have said I had plans. But something held me back. Maybe it was a sense of duty, or maybe just the unwillingness to be alone in an empty house. We began sorting through boxes in the garage, and his presence filled the space with a strange tension. I tried to focus on the items in front of me, but I couldn't ignore how he stood just a little too close. His voice was soft, but there was something in it that stirred an odd unease in me. "You know, this house reminds me of your childhood laughter," he said, sifting through old toys. "Selena always said you were such a lively little girl." I felt the blood rush to my cheeks. His words seemed innocent, yet filled with an underlying subtext. I steered the conversation in another direction, asking him about my mother, about how they met, and why their marriage, which I had always thought was perfect, had ended. Milo sighed, sat down on the edge of an old chair, and looked at me with the same strange expression I had seen in the photograph. "Sometimes people do what seems right, but the heart doesn't always agree." His words stuck in me like a splinter. What did he mean by that? What did it mean for my mother? And why was he looking at me as if he saw something I hadn't yet come to understand about myself? By evening, we had finished with the garage, and he left, but the feeling of his presence lingered. I tried to distract myself, cleaning, cooking dinner, but the strange sensation wouldn't let go. I pulled out that photograph from the box and stared at it until day turned to night. The phone vibrated again. It was Clayton texting that he was on his way home. I put the photograph back, but I couldn't shake the image of their faces or Milo's words from my mind. That night was the beginning of something I couldn't yet explain, but I could already feel it quietly changing everything around me. The attic had been my sanctuary since childhood. It smelled of dust, old wood, and memories. When Milo offered to help sort through the clutter, my initial instinct was to refuse, but then I decided it was better not to be alone in the house. Perhaps, deep down, I was looking for an excuse to sort through not just the things, but also my thoughts. We climbed the steep staircase, and as soon as I switched on the light, a battlefield of boxes, suitcases, and furniture covered in a thick layer of dust unfolded before us. Milo chuckled. "This looks like a museum exhibit. Some of this must have been your most treasured possessions." I shrugged, avoiding his gaze for too long. "Mom loved keeping everything. I just couldn't bring myself to throw it all away." We began sifting through the items. Milo was surprisingly thoughtful, examining every little thing with respect. Sometimes he'd pause to ask me why I had chosen to keep a particular object. I felt an odd warmth growing between us, as if his presence gave my memories a weight they hadn't held before. When we stumbled upon a small box, my heart skipped a beat. It was the same box I remembered from my childhood, but had never dared to open. Its ornate surface was covered in dust, yet it still looked as though it held something significant. "Are you sure you want to open it?" Milo asked, holding the box in his hands. I nodded. "I think so." Inside were letters. My mother's handwriting was neat, almost formal. I unfolded the first letter, and from the very first lines, a strange unease settled over me. She wrote about how hard it was to find happiness, how her choices weren't always deliberate, and how often she felt lonely, even among those she loved. "Something interesting?" he asked, leaning over my shoulder. I set the letter aside, not ready to discuss it with him. "Just her thoughts," I replied evasively, but his gaze lingered on me longer than necessary. He didn't say anything, yet I felt that he understood more than he let on. It was an unsettling sensation, as though he saw me in a way I didn't see myself. After a moment, we resumed our work. The conversations between us grew more personal. I shared childhood memories, and he spoke of how difficult things had been after my mother's death. At one point, his hand brushed against mine. It was a quick, almost imperceptible gesture, but I felt it like an electric current across my skin. "Sorry," he said softly, though his voice didn't carry the tone of a simple apology. I looked at him, and something inside me shifted. There was a warmth in his eyes, mixed with a deep, lingering sadness, as if he was seeing not just me, but something beyond me. Seconds stretched into what felt like hours. I didn't know what to say or do, and it seemed he didn't either. But before I could react, he leaned in, cautiously, almost hesitantly. I didn't pull away. A moment later, I felt his lips on mine. It lasted only a second or two, but it felt as though time had stopped. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions: surprise, fear, a fleeting sense of euphoria, and immediately the crushing realization of how wrong this was. "No," I whispered, pulling away sharply. I stood up, stumbling over the scattered boxes, and ran out of the room, leaving Milo behind. As I hurried down the stairs, I felt a knot of guilt tighten in my chest. In my bedroom, I closed the door and leaned against it. My heart was pounding so loudly, it felt as though the entire house could hear it. I tried to convince myself it had been a fleeting, accidental moment, but deep down, I knew, no, it was more than just a mistake. I realized that in that single moment, something had happened that couldn't be undone. The next day, I found myself in the attic again. Only this time, I was alone. The objects that had seemed like random chaos yesterday now appeared to reproach me silently. The box stood in the corner, its dark wood looking even heavier than before. I didn't want to approach it, yet something inside me urged me forward. I opened it again, as if expecting to find something new. Instead of letters, my eyes fell on a black leather notebook I hadn't noticed before. It was my mother's diary. The pages were slightly yellowed, but the handwriting was still clear. I held the diary in my trembling hands. "Are you ready to know what's inside? Are you sure you want the truth?" I asked myself. There was no answer, and I simply placed the diary back without opening it. I was afraid it would contain answers to questions I hadn't dared to ask. When I came down from the attic, time seemed to freeze. The house was quiet, too quiet, as if all life had held its breath. I tried to distract myself, cleaning, making dinner, checking emails. Nothing worked. The entire day passed in a state of inner turmoil. Toward evening, I heard the front door open. Clayton had come home earlier than usual. His voice was cheerful, as always. "Ellery, I thought I'd catch you doing something interesting." I smiled but didn't look at him. "Just tidying up the house." Clayton stepped closer, peering over my shoulder. His scent was familiar and comforting, yet at that moment, it felt foreign. "Are you okay?" he asked, wrapping his arms around my shoulders. I averted my gaze. "Just tired. That attic." So many memories, you know. He nodded quietly, but I could tell he didn't believe me. His gaze lingered on me longer than usual, but he said nothing. Instead, he went to the bedroom, leaving me alone in the kitchen. I watched him go, feeling a lump rise in my throat. I wanted to tell him everything about the photograph, the letters, the box, about what happened with Maelo. But how could I? How could I explain something I didn't even understand myself? The phone vibrated on the table, jolting me out of my thoughts. A message. From Maelo. Ellery, I know how you feel. Please, let's talk. You can't just leave this alone. You know it as well as I do. I closed my eyes, feeling a wave of guilt surge inside me. I wanted to delete the message, but instead, I just placed the phone face down. My mind raced. Talk? About what? How could I explain anything? If I agreed, it would only make things worse. Clayton reappeared in the kitchen. He stood in the doorway, looking at me as if trying to solve a mystery. Ah, are you sure you're okay? He asked again. I turned and forced a smile. Yes, just too much on my mind. He stepped closer and hugged me. His touch was warm, and a flood of emotions washed over me, but they weren't love or affection. They were guilt. I hated myself for not being able to be honest with him. If something's wrong, just tell me, he whispered. I'm here. I nodded, even though I knew I would never tell him the truth. His words were drowned out by the noise of my own thoughts. I felt the past of my family creeping into my life like a dense fog, but the scariest part was knowing that I had allowed it to happen. That night, lying in bed next to Clayton, I couldn't sleep. His breathing was steady, but my heart was pounding like a caged animal. My phone lay on the bedside table, and Melo's message kept echoing in my head. It wouldn't leave me in peace. I knew ignoring it much longer would be difficult, but I also understood that if I agreed to meet, there would be no turning back. A family dinner, meant to be a quiet evening with loved ones, turned into a test of endurance for me. Melo had suggested we gather at his place, saying he wanted to create a warm atmosphere to remember our mother. I agreed, hoping that with Clayton and other relatives present, I could avoid the conversations lingering unspoken between us since that kiss. As Clayton and I stepped into the house, I was instantly enveloped by its familiar atmosphere. The scent of fresh flowers mingled with the faint trace of paint on the walls, always reminding me of childhood. Milo greeted us at the door with his usual smile, but his gaze lingered on me a fraction longer than it should have. I pretended not to notice. The dinner table was lively, filled with animated chatter. Relatives talked about holidays and the latest news, while Clayton enthusiastically described his project, which seemed to consume his entire life. I tried to stay engaged, nodding, chiming in occasionally, but for the most part, I felt like an observer. Every movement Malo made, every glance he cast in my direction, put me on edge. When he shared a story from his youth, I thought I detected a tremor in his voice when he said my name, though it could have just been my imagination. Ellery, Clayton suddenly said, addressing me. You seem a little distant. Is everything okay? I felt the weight of everyone's attention turn toward me. Yes, I'm fine, I replied quickly. Just a bit tired. Mello glanced at me, his eyes asking a silent question he couldn't put into words. I immediately dropped my gaze to my plate. Later, as the dinner reached its peak, I caught Clayton throwing a quick glance at me, then at Mello. His brow furrowed, but he seemed to decide it wasn't worth pursuing. The evening dragged on endlessly, but finally, when the conversations began to dwindle, Clayton and I said our goodbyes and headed home. He was quiet throughout the drive, while I focused on the road, trying not to dwell on what had transpired at dinner. Once we got home, I realized I couldn't avoid it any longer. My mother's diary lay in the drawer like a beacon I was too afraid to face. While Clayton went to take a shower, I sat alone in the bedroom. Taking out the diary, I sat on the bed, opened to the first page, and began to read. The early entries were simple: descriptions of everyday life, memories of my baby's smile, and her dreams for me to have a happy future. But the further I read, the heavier her words became. One entry, written a few years before her death, left me in shock. I never loved Milo. It was a choice made for me, not by me. My family insisted he would be the best support for us after my first marriage fell apart. I was desperate, and he seemed like the right solution. But how can you live with someone you don't truly feel is yours? I froze, rereading those lines over and over. How could she have hidden this from me? I'd always seen their relationship as something ideal, but now I understood it had been an illusion. Another entry shed even more light. Sometimes I feel like Maelo sees someone else in me, not the real me, as if I'm just a reflection of something he wants but can't find. That feeling scares me. Those words sent a shiver through me. She had felt something eerily similar to what I was experiencing now. But if she knew, why had she endured it? When Clayton returned to the bedroom, I quickly closed the diary and slipped it back into the drawer. He collapsed onto the bed with a sigh. "Long day?" I asked, trying to sound natural. "Yeah," he replied, staring at the ceiling. "And yours?" "Nothing special," I mumbled. We lay side by side, yet it felt like we were worlds apart. Clayton fell asleep quickly, but I remained awake, staring into the darkness. My mother's words echoed in my mind. I felt like the past was pulling me under, and with each passing day, it became harder to distinguish where her story ended and mine began. My relationship with Clayton felt like a taut string, growing thinner with each passing day. We barely spoke. His days were consumed by work, and mine by a constant battle with thoughts I couldn't shake. Yet, oddly enough, he tried. One evening, as I prepared dinner, he suddenly approached me, wrapped his arms around my shoulders, and said, "Ellery, we need to break out of this routine. How about a trip? Just you and me." I didn't know how to respond. The idea seemed reasonable, even romantic, but something inside me clenched tightly. I forced a smile, though it felt strained. "That's a great idea, Clayton. When were you thinking?" He smiled back, clearly pleased by my agreement. "Next weekend. We'll find a cozy cabin by the lake, turn off our phones, and just enjoy each other's company." I nodded, trying to match his enthusiasm, but deep down, I already knew I probably wouldn't be able to go through with it. The following week, just days before the trip, Clayton brought it up again over dinner. I felt trapped. The words from my mother's diary still echoed in my mind, casting shadows over every conversation I had with him. "Have you packed yet?" he asked, slicing into his steak. I pretended to think. "You know, I just got assigned a project at work. I'm afraid I'll have to postpone the trip." His fork froze mid-air. He looked at me as if trying to figure out whether I was joking or serious. "Ellery, you know we need this. You, me. We've grown so distant." His words were true, but they only made me feel worse. "I know, Clayton. I'll try to make it up to you some other way. I just have so much going on right now." He sighed and placed his fork on the plate. "All right, if you can't, I understand." But his eyes told a different story. They showed he didn't understand at all. On Friday, Clayton left for the office, leaving me alone. All morning, I thought about our conversation, his disappointment, and the nagging feeling that he probably deserved better. But instead of doing something for us, I retreated further into myself. The buzzing of my phone pulled me from my thoughts. The message was from Milo. "Ellery, I'd like to talk to you. Please give me a chance to explain everything." I didn't reply right away. I stared at the screen, torn between wanting to leave everything behind and needing to understand what was happening inside me. Eventually, I wrote back, "I can meet you at 3, at your place." When I arrived at his house, he greeted me at the door with the same tense look that had haunted me for weeks. We sat in the living room, silence hanging between us for several minutes. "Thank you for coming," he finally said. "I know this, all of this, is wrong." I looked at him, trying to read his thoughts, but his face was a closed book. Yes, it's wrong, I agreed quietly. That's why I'm here. We can't keep going like this. He nodded, but his eyes betrayed deep pain. Ellery, I need you to know. I never wanted things to go this far. Then why? I asked. Why did you let it happen? He turned away, as if gathering his thoughts, then spoke words I didn't expect to hear. Because I've always been an outsider. To everyone. Even to Selena. The words struck me like lightning. What do you mean? He looked directly at me, and I saw something in his eyes I hadn't noticed before. A mix of exhaustion and bitterness. Your mother never loved me. I knew it from the start, but I kept trying. Because I wanted to be part of something real. But I always felt like I didn't belong. I froze. His confession, though it should have clarified things, only confused me further. And you think, you and I are something real? I asked, barely breathing. He hesitated, as if choosing his words carefully. I don't know, but I do know this. When I look at you, I see something I've never been able to see in anyone else. His words hurt me, but not in the way I expected. Instead of a romantic spark, I felt a heavy weight. I began to realize that my feelings for him were just an attempt to fill a void. I think you're wrong, I finally replied. We're both searching for something we can't find. But it's not in each other. He didn't argue. His face remained tense, but there was a strange acceptance in his eyes. Maybe you're right. When I left his house, I felt lighter than I had anticipated, but a mark remained inside me, a mark I didn't yet know how to erase. The road to Milo's house was unusually quiet. Normally, at this time, the hum of cars and voices created a steady background noise, but today everything seemed muted. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was symbolic, a silence foretelling an ending. I had decided to leave. The decision hadn't come easily, but I no longer had the strength to stay. The house I shared with Clayton reminded me of the woman I no longer felt like, the woman I had been when we first bought it. I needed time to figure out who I was now, what I wanted, and what I had become. But before I could leave, I knew I had to close the chapter with Milo. When he opened the door, his expression held a mixture of surprise and unease. It seemed he hadn't expected to see me, even though I had warned him in advance. We stepped into the living room. Everything was tidy, as always, but it felt lifeless, as though it mirrored his state of mind. Milo gestured for me to sit, but I remained standing. I didn't want this conversation to drag on. I'm leaving, I said, avoiding his eyes. You're leaving? He repeated, as though he hadn't understood. I need time. I need to figure out what's happening to me. But before I go, I wanted to talk to you. He frowned, his face growing serious. Ellery, I understand how you feel, and I understand why you're leaving, but you need to know everything that happened between us. It was real. His words hung in the air, tension growing between us. Real, I repeated, finally looking up at him. Milo, it was never real. It was an illusion. We were both searching for something we lacked. You, a way to prove you're not an outsider. Me, a way to forget my life was falling apart. He opened his mouth to say something, but then stopped. His hands clenched into fists, then relaxed again. Maybe you're right, he said quietly, but that doesn't change the fact that He hesitated, as though the words wouldn't come. That you what? I asked, my emotions swelling inside me. Love me? Or love the idea that I could give you what you didn't get from my mother? The words escaped before I could stop them. I saw his face twist, but it wasn't anger I saw. It was pain. I don't know, he finally admitted, after a long pause. Maybe you're right. Maybe it wasn't about you. Maybe it was about me. But that doesn't mean it didn't matter. I looked away. His words hurt, but I knew they were true. He stepped closer, and I could feel the warmth of his presence filling the space between us. He didn't make any sudden movements, didn't reach for me, but his closeness was palpable, almost tangible. I raised my eyes and saw in his gaze the same mix of tenderness and sorrow that had haunted me for weeks. When he leaned in, I didn't pull away. His lips brushed mine, and in that moment, I understood. It was goodbye. There was no passion in the kiss, no promises, only the shared realization that this was the end. When he pulled back, I stepped away, feeling something inside me release. "This is the end, Milo," I said. He nodded, his face calm, but his eyes still held bitterness. "I know." I left without looking back. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I could breathe. The moment was a turning point. I realized that my connection with Milo had never been love. It was an attempt to fill a void, to escape a reality I hadn't wanted to face. But now I knew I had to confront it. In the car, I gripped the steering wheel and closed my eyes. A new path lay ahead, and though it terrified me, I knew I could no longer remain in the past. When I returned home, the house greeted me with its familiar silence. Clayton hadn't come back from work yet, and for that I was grateful. I needed some time to gather my thoughts. I changed into comfortable clothes, brewed some tea, and sat down at the kitchen table. Thoughts of what I had done, and what still lay ahead, refused to leave me. My phone vibrated on the table. I reached out to see who was messaging me, but at that moment, the door opened, and Clayton walked in. I instinctively flipped the phone face down, hoping he wouldn't notice. "Hey," he said, taking off his jacket. "You're home early." "Hi," I replied quietly. He placed his keys on the table, looked at me carefully, and suddenly narrowed his eyes, as though he'd noticed something. "You left your phone in the bathroom this morning," he said calmly, though his tone carried a note of suspicion. I froze. I accidentally saw a message. Not on purpose, but it seemed odd. A chill ran through me. I tried to keep my expression neutral, but I could see his gaze shifting, his expression changing. "Ellery," he continued, "who is Milo?" His question was direct, but I didn't know how to answer. What could I say? How could I explain? "It's not what you think," I began, but he interrupted me. "And what exactly am I supposed to think? I saw the messages. Are you saying they mean nothing?" His voice grew louder, though it wasn't quite shouting. It was the voice of someone struggling to maintain control while feeling their world crumble. I I was just talking to him. It's complicated to explain." "Explain!" he finally exploded, throwing his hands up. "You've been talking to another man, hiding it from me. What else am I supposed to think, Ellery?" I felt tears welling up, but forced them back. "It's not what you think. There's nothing between us." "Nothing?" he repeated, his face hardening. "Then why did you hide it? Why have you been so distant?" His words hit me like blows. I knew I deserved them. "Because I didn't know how to tell you," I finally burst out. "I didn't know how to explain how I feel." "How you feel?" he asked, his voice softening slightly, though the bitterness remained. I was silent for a long time, afraid to speak the truth. But it seemed this moment was unavoidable. "I feel lonely, Clayton," I whispered. "I felt that way for a long time. I tried to hide it, to ignore it, but it never went away." He stepped back, as if my words had physically struck him. "Lonely?" he repeated. "Why didn't you tell me before? Why didn't you try to change things?" "I didn't know how," I admitted. "I didn't know how to start this conversation. You've always been so busy, so focused on work, that I felt like my problems didn't matter." His eyes flared with anger, though it wasn't directed at me. "I was trying to make things better for us, Ellery. I was trying, and now you're telling me I was the reason you felt lonely." "No," I replied quickly. "It's not just you, it's me. I've been lost. I didn't know what I wanted." He fell silent, and the tension in the room became unbearable. Finally, he spoke again, his voice softer, but still full of pain. "Maybe we should try therapy, together? I don't want to lose this." His suggestion caught me off guard. I saw genuine determination in his eyes, a real desire to fix things, but at the same time, I knew it wasn't the solution. Clayton, I said, feeling my heart tighten, you're a good man. You deserve someone who can give you everything you need. I I don't think I can be that woman. That's it? He asked, his voice trembling. You're just giving up? I'm not giving up, I said, forcing myself to hold his gaze. I just think we've reached a dead end. He looked away, and I saw tears forming on his lashes. This was one of the hardest moments of my life. I loved you, Ellery, he said, standing and heading toward the door. I still love you, but I guess that's not enough. When the door closed behind him, I was left alone, feeling the house grow darker and emptier. I knew I had made the right choice, but that didn't make it any less painful. The house emptied faster than I had anticipated. I sold it almost immediately after Clayton packed up his belongings. The buyers were a quiet young couple who seemed to fall in love with the house at first sight. Their smiles and excited chatter about renovations and future plans made me feel strangely detached, as if the house had ceased to belong to me long before I handed over the keys. The last few days before leaving felt like a trance. I packed boxes, signed papers, but my thoughts kept drifting back to my mother's journal. It had become something of a final puzzle piece I needed to fit into place before I could move forward. When I finally reached the ocean, it felt like I was breathing for the first time in a long while. The small rental house, perched on a hill, overlooked the endless shoreline. Inside, it was nearly empty, just a bed, a table, and a couple of chairs. But it was enough. That first night, I fell asleep to the sound of waves, but woke with a strange feeling. The journal lay on the bedside table. I reached for it, sensing that this was a moment I had feared yet could no longer avoid. My mother's final entries were heavier than I had expected. I made a choice, not for myself, but to live up to what was expected of me. It brought happiness to no one. I pretended everything was fine, but every day I felt something inside me dying. The words blurred before my eyes, each one robbing me of air. My mother, whom I had always thought of as strong and self-assured, had been a prisoner of her own doubts and fears. I tried to convince myself that it was the right thing to do, but now, as the years have passed, I realize the sacrifices I made didn't bring me happiness. They only turned me into a shadow of myself. I closed the journal, unable to read further. This time, the tears came on their own, and I didn't try to stop them. The next morning, I woke with a clear sense that it was time to let it all go. I carried the journal to the shore, feeling the sand crunch beneath my feet. The wind was cool, and the sea stretched out endlessly, like the life that still awaited me. I placed the journal on a makeshift pyre of driftwood and struck a match. The fire started slowly, but soon engulfed the pages. I watched as the words disappeared, turning to ash. When the last corner of paper burned away, I closed my eyes. With the fire went the past, the burdens, the mistakes, and the echoes of choices that weren't my own. I stayed on the shore for a long time, the wind tugging at my hair, the waves creeping closer to my feet. I didn't know what lay ahead. I didn't know if I could build a new life, but in that moment, I felt free. As I turned and walked back toward the house, my face reflected everything I felt inside: sadness, the ache of loss, but also relief.